So
Tell
we are
all the
joined
secrets.
now. We are joined now by Assistant Professor Albert Sheng. Hello, Albert.
Hey, hello, Conrad.
Wonderful that you can join us. You are working at University of Arkansas.
Yep, that's correct.
And for how many years have you been there?
This is my third year here on faculty.
Yeah, great. And I read your study about the relation between higher education and anti-Semitism. And maybe you can briefly explain what was the most surprising findings for yourself and your colleagues.
Sure. Yeah, so my colleagues and I, we wanted to do a study to see if we could figure out a perhaps a slightly modified way of measuring anti-Semitism by doing a survey based on trying to identify when certain segments of the population reveal a double standard and treat the case where that involves Jews in a more antagonistic or restrictive way. And so what was most surprising really was based on the way we measured anti-Semitism or tried to detect it, greater antagonism and hostility towards Jews was actually more concentrated among the higher educated. So especially those that had more than a college degree, a four-year degree, they were more likely to treat Jews with more hostility.
Do you have any idea why that is?
Yeah, so I think there's two things going on. So this is against the conventional wisdom, I think. Yeah. We usually think that, or at least there's a narrative and a story out there that education is the medicine, the antidote to prejudice and bigotry, and not just anti-Semitism, but against all groups. And now there is some value to education. Certainly, education. Presumably, when you go through education, you learn about liberal values and democratic values. People theorize too that it exposes you to different worldviews and different people from different backgrounds. And so, the instruction in liberal values and how kind of liberal democracy works, together with having a chance to interact with people from different backgrounds, supposedly or theoretically, that's supposed to make one more tolerant, one less prejudiced. Now, what we find is the opposite of that, and this is not necessarily to say that that theory is wrong, but maybe it's overstated.
Yeah.
What we think is going on is two things. One, in prior research that tries to measure prejudice or anti-Semitism, we think the highly educated, they're smart enough to know what the survey is asking for. And so basically they can give you the socially desirable answer. They can hide their prejudice by giving a socially desirable answer. So, if you give them a survey that asks them if they agree with certain tropes or anti-Semitic statements about Jews, of course they know to respond in a way that makes them look favorable. The other thing with education is we think that that simple instruction in facts about how liberal democracy works or liberal values works is not enough to counter, I guess, all of our dispositions to seek our own political self-interest. So my colleague Jay Green likes to think of this like stealing. So everybody knows stealing is wrong, but in certain cases,
come away with it.
when you can get away with it, especially if you're savvy enough to get away with it, what's stopping you from getting away with it, right? And so the thing that stops you is character, it's virtue. And So I think what's missing from education is the idea that education is not just about giving information about how liberal democracy works or information about what different cultures are like. It's what we also need in education is the cultivating of character, so you restrain the times when you want to exert your own political self-interest at the expense of others. And I don't know that, for centuries now, I think, or decades at least, we've taken out that value side of education.
Vi håper du vil abonnere på Med Israel for fred på YouTube. Her finner du et stort antall foredrag av internasjonale eksperter, aktuelle direktesendinger og korte videoklipp. Husk å like, abonnere og motta varsler. MIFFs YouTube-kanal vil gi deg noe alle trenger, mer forståelse for Israel.
So we are joined again by Assistant Professor Albert Sheng from University of Arkansas. We're so glad that you could join us early morning American time.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about the feedback you have got so far, but I also wanted to raise with you some results that we got actually in a national poll here in Norway 2 years ago. Because we also found some interesting relationship between higher education and attitudes towards Israel specifically. So we found that resistance to increased trade and cooperation with Israel was growing the higher education the respondents had. And we found that we asked them whether they support that Israel should remain the national homeland of the Jewish people. And there is a 8 to 9% gap between people with higher education and those with non-education or vocational schooling in a negative, so in a negative way. So that's why I really was curious about your research, because it kind of aligns to our finding and the experience of within Europe, and even traditionally, much of the anti-Semitism in Europe has been spread within political movements where the education was really high. Comparable.
No, I think that's not surprising, and certainly our results would be consistent with what you're observing. I do know that some researchers in this area have also tried to separate measuring opinions about just Israel politically, and to try to separate that from anti-Semitic attitudes. And the two are distinct issues, but even that said, there is a correlation between the two. That certainly, if you are more anti-Semitic, that's correlated with not having pro-Israel attitudes.
And research here in Norway by the Holocaust Center, which is a state-funded institution, they found that the more pro-Palestinian you are, the higher likelihood there is that you also support anti-Semitic stereotypes, or So I actually shared your research with the researchers at that institute, and they were interested in looking more into it, because every 5 years they do a scientific study of anti-Semitism in Norway. So hopefully,
we're happy to hope that helps them.
You obviously published your findings, and you published also in Tablet magazine, maybe also in other outlets. And what have been the feedback so far?
It's been, I'd say there's probably two main strands of feedback. So I'll start with the positive side first.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I think we've gotten definitely feedback from folks that you know, to them this was kind of a breath of fresh air, because they've been kind of seeing these kinds of patterns. And again, remember, it's kind of against the conventional wisdom, right? That you know, what seems to be higher levels of anti-Semitism or a greater expression of that among the highly educated, right? That, again, that's not really what most people would think. But, you know, for some people, being in higher ed or knowing folks, you know, they had taken the unconventional view, and then here's a study here that is consistent with that. And so we've definitely gotten some feedback from folks like that, finding this very plausible, and certainly, I mean, it certainly raises a lot of questions to think about, you know, why that's the case, and you know, how bad is it? How true is it? How prevalent is it? Right. So, you know, it's sparking a lot of important discussions and questions for these folks. On maybe the more critical side, I think we've gotten folks who dispute the way we measure anti-Semitism here. And they, in some sense, there is some validity to the criticism. So the way it works, so maybe just to give a little bit of background on how our measure works. So what we do is, so we surveyed a national sample of adults in the United States. And we basically present each person with one of two versions of a question, and then ask them to respond to the subject in the question. And so, for instance, essentially one version of the question presents a situation, and then asks the respondent to apply a principle to Jews. And then the other version asks respondents to apply the same principle to non-Jews. And so, for instance, one example of this is, so here in the United States, we actually had a lawsuit in our military because someone, a Jewish person, was asked to remove their yarmulke during their service. You know, we had a soldier here who was asked to remove their yarmulke. And then we had another real situation where someone serving in the military who was a Sikh, and the Sikh was asked to remove their turban. And so we presented both cases to respondents. And it's important to know here that no respondent saw both cases. They only saw one, so that way they wouldn't know what we're asking. And so if you look at the general public, it's about even, right? The public expresses the same level of agreement or disagreement with the military making these individuals remove their religious headgear. But if you look at, if you break out the sample by people with more than a 4-year degree, people with a 4-year degree are more likely to agree that the military should ban the yarmulke rather than ban the turban, right? And so there is this greater restrictive treatment towards Jews. Now, the criticism.
Was it surprising for you that you got these results?
Yeah, I mean, so you know, when I designed the items, we were looking, and my colleagues, we were designing items to think where, like, these should be equivalent. Treatment of religious headgear in the military, right? There should be no difference. You know, you just apply a principle equally, regardless of the background of the person. And yet you see this disparity when it comes to dealing with the kippah versus the Sikh turban. And so now the criticism that we've gotten is that these situations actually aren't equivalent. Now this one maybe has been less criticized, but we had other situations in there, you know, asking about regulation of private schools. So Are you in favor of regulating yeshiva? And then the other version was, are you in favor of regulating a Montessori private school, right?
Yeah.
And so there is the criticism we've gotten is whether all the different pairs of questions we had are truly equivalent.
Yeah.
Now there's an
Question
argument
was
to be
really
had
high.
there. I think there's a fair discussion. Are the two really equivalent? But it also occurs to us that someone who's truly a bigot, someone who's truly anti-Semitic, can always figure out a way to rationalize a difference between two things. And so, we have to, I guess this really opens up a discussion, right?
Yeah.
Is there really some reasonable ground, some standard by which we can conclude that the situations are equivalent, right? Also acknowledging the fact that to someone who's anti-Semitic, they will always find a difference and argue, right, that the two aren't equivalent. And so I think this is the main criticism we've gotten. How do we justify whether the two situations we had are exactly different? But, again, there is some validity to that, but also, right, the true anti-Semites will always find a difference. And so, at what point do you fall into which situation? I think that's a healthy discussion to be had.
Yeah. After a short break, we will be back with more with Assistant Professor Albert Sheng.
Husk å følge Med Israel for fred på Facebook. Når du liker, kommenterer og deler våre saker, vil israelernes argumenter bli mer synlige for familie og venner. Det jo akkurat dette du vil. Her et godt tips. Velg følgeinnstillinger. Du kan stille inn at saker fra MIFF får høyere prioritet i nyhetsoppdateringen din. Og du kan skru på egne varsler om artikler, videoer og direktesendinger. Med Israel for freds Facebook-side gir deg noe alle trenger, mer forståelse for Israel.
We are back now with Albert Cheng. Thanks again, Albert, for sharing your insights. And you have now measured how higher educated people react to questions when they don't know that you measure anti-Semitic attitudes. And do you think these kind of questions could be made, say, to measure the attitude of higher educated people to Muslims, for example, or to other groups?
Yeah, no, I think you definitely can use this approach to gauge essentially the presence of a double standard among segments of the population. And so and we hope people will take this approach over in the future. Also, to add more questions, to think of other different kinds of situations where presumably there's a double standard. And I mean, certainly, a lot of the questions we asked are specific to the US because those are the issues that are salient here. But I'm sure, in Norway or other countries, there's are different possible double standards that come up. So I do hope that people kind of take this approach, this technology and method to study this.
It's one of my old favorite tactics is to ask those who want to boycott Israel, what other countries do you want to boycott?
Right, exactly.
And you have the double standard right there.
Yeah.
In your studies and your research, have you also worked with any other Israel-related issues?
Yeah. Also with Jay Green, who's co-authored on this, the piece that came out in Tablet. The previous study we did was to study travel to Israel. So what does traveling to Israel do in terms of perceptions of Israel, in terms of knowledge about Israel, anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we had a great opportunity. This is before the pandemic when we could still all travel to Israel.
And what did you find? And could you get results from kind of different groups of travelers, or from Jewish, evangelical, or secular? Or I'm curious, please.
Yeah. So for this one, we didn't have a large enough sample to split it up. But what's interesting, so in the so I guess it was 2 summers ago, 2019. I took a group of
a lifetime ago.
Yes, yeah. I took a group of teachers in evangelical Christian schools here across the U.S. on a kind of an education and kind of faith trip to Israel. And then Jay, my colleague, took he and someone else put together a undergraduate study abroad program through the business school. And so their trip was we all know Israel, startup nation, right? The kind of entrepreneurship and startup culture that's there. So we used Israel as a kind of a case study for these business degree students. And so they took a trip there. And what we did, so the design there was different. We actually did a field experiment. So we had a bunch of people apply to go on this trip, and we used the lottery to allocate spots to the trip. And so here we actually have experimental causal evidence of what happens when you go on a trip to Israel, right? Because you have a treatment group. So this is like, the medical trials now, right? You have a treatment group where the medicine is going to Israel, and then a control group where, they don't get that medicine of going to Israel. And so we weren't able to separate by different segments of, by the background of the people who went. But what we did find was for the people who went on the trip, definitely they recognize anti-Semitism as a problem. And so, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but certainly a big gain in seeing how anti-Semitism is actually a problem in Europe and also in the Middle East. A lot of increase in knowledge about Israel. And so, just knowing, all of them had no idea that of the startup culture in Israel. And so they go there, and this is, it blew their minds. And, a lot of them knew the history of Israel, just since the 1940s and all the 6-Day War and all that history. They knew that better. We even found just general interest about Israel. And so we asked them whether they start to follow media and news about Israel. And so people who went started to consume more media and to just know what was going on in Israel. So definitely saw increases in knowledge about Israel. The other interesting finding is these changes in perceptions about Israel. So we had a few questions asking about whether they thought Israel respected democracy, respected human rights, respected religious freedom. And so for the people who went, they became much more likely to agree with those statements. And so while they were there, they just kind of saw, that Israel is not the kind of apartheid state that some people make it out to be. Sure, it's not perfect, and still issues to work out. But what they mostly saw too was all the good that folks there, Jews and Arabs, were trying to work together to build. And so, they definitely recognize that by going on that trip.
I think it's the best vaccine against anti-Semitism.
With no side effects, I think.
except that you want to you take a new shot.
Me, myself?
No,
no.
You mean you want to go back to Israel?
Except yes, you do want to take more shots. Yes, yeah, that's absolutely true. All the people who traveled wanted to try to sign up for the next trip, and I said, no, you've already gone, unfortunately. So it's someone else's turn now.
Have you been many times to Israel yourself?
Yes, yeah. So certainly for the trips that I've hosted, yeah, I was supposed to go back again in 2020, but we all know what happened, and so that would have been I think the 4th trip back at that time. But
wonderful.
Yeah, at some point.
What's your favorite place in Israel?
Favorite place? Oh, that's tough. On my last trip there, I spent more time in the Banyas region than I ever had, and yeah, I think that was just a good experience. It was beautiful there, and just to hike and walk around there. I think that's probably what stuck out most in my most recent trip.
It's different from Arkansas, or?
Oh, actually similar. So Arkansas here, we do have a lot of outdoors hiking activities. The terrain is obviously very different.
Yeah.
But similar kind of opportunity to be outside and look at nature and so we share that similarity, but different flora and fauna.
Albert, I will let you go. Thanks a lot for joining us, and thanks for all your work. And if you find anything more interesting related to Israel or Jewish issues, please let me know.
Yeah, I'm happy to, and thanks again for reaching out, and it was a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah. Okay.